Welcome to the Dark Mind Podcast. All right, friends and familiars. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Dark Mind Podcast, where we explore the boundless realm of dark literature and film. On today's show, I have a writer whose name is synonymous with spine-chilling tales and haunting narratives. He's a Stoker award nominee, and he's joining me today to discuss his recent novel, Devils Kill Devils. So without further ado, join me as we delve into the dark insight of Johnny Compton. All right, folks, we are live on YouTube and Instagram with Johnny Compton. Johnny, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back, man. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. A pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining me on this third day of August 2024. I really enjoyed your first novel, The Spite House, due to its highly original premise and the blending of an urban legend with the real concept of a spite house. So when I saw the mention of your newest work, Devils Kill Devils, I had no idea what to expect other than finely crafted prose. What I found was an epic tale with a blend of fantasy, creature horror, psychological horror, and grief horror, all wrapped up in a perfectly structured narrative. So thank you for allowing me to check this out before it's released to the masses, and thank you for being on the show today.
And thank you for that introduction and all the praise for the book. I'm really proud of this one. I was proud of The Spite House. Definitely went in a different direction with this one. I'm a little bit hopeful but anxious about how the world's going to receive it because it's so different in a lot of respects from The Spite House.
And when is it released again?
September 24th.
September 24th. Okay. So the book follows Sarita, a young woman with a guardian angel named Angelo. Angelo has protected Sarita from danger all her life, which made her increasingly reckless with high-risk sports and other dangerous activities because she was confident in Angelo's magical protection. But on her wedding night, Angelo brutally slaughters her husband, Frank, and that's where the story begins. And I mean, that is a powerful, inciting incident. Your betrothed being brutally slaughtered by your guardian angel. How did the premise of a guardian angel turning on their charge evolve?
I've had this idea for several years, and that opening chapter, as you described it, with some modifications, has been in my mind for over a decade, well over a decade now, gosh. When I was much, much younger, in my 20s, I was when I was back trying to write movie scripts. I wrote a pretty bad script about an assassin. And at one point, somebody makes a comment that I thought was cool at the time that's pretty corny about instead of a guardian angel, you were probably born with a guardian devil. And I thought that sounded cool at the time, but then as I got a little older, it was like, that's pretty bad. But the idea of a guardian devil stuck with me. Like, what if you thought you had a guardian angel, but it turned out to be evil?
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out to be something, what is it protecting you from? And so from there, I thought, what if you're a guardian angel? I thought of the exact scenario. On her wedding night, a woman is with her husband, guardian angel enters the room and kills him. And originally it was the style of kill, like you said, is brutal in the book. The original version of the kill that I had envisioned was so brutal and so swift, it was kind of comical. So I had to adjust some things there to make it a little bit, it was almost a, comedy version of it. It was just too swift. And I thought it would be a shocking moment, but I was like, no, as I'm writing this, I need you to live with the trauma of this with her for a little bit, and having her fight Angelo and try to explain to him. And at first, her first reaction, even seeing him in the room, is, well, because he's protected me all these other times, he's surely here to protect us both. And she's still trusting of him in that moment. And she's thinking, is the hotel on fire? Is there an active shooter? There's got to be some reason he's here. And instead, he starts attacking her husband, who she's never explained this to, obviously. She's never told her husband. Yeah, she's never told her husband, I have a guardian angel. And that factors into the book later as well, where she has some irrational guilt about the idea of, what if I just warned him? And he would have never, of course, believed her. But even then, she's thinking, well, maybe I could have saved him indirectly, because he might have thought I was just insane and never married me because of it. So all of these ideas kind of came together over time. And then when I read a book of the Bible, a book of certain denomination, the Bible of certain denominations, and in others it's Apocrypha, the book of Tobit, and it had a demon attacking a woman named Sarah's husbands repeatedly on their wedding nights. I was like, okay, I kind of have something here that's been done before, in something that's relatively obscure, and I think I can really capitalize on that as well. And there's definitely it solidified for me that this is a pretty interesting idea and pretty fascinating, and can really open people up in that first chapter with, what the hell am I even in for here?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, I was raised with a pretty straightforward fundamentalist view of Christianity, but when you look into, as you were saying, books that are considered apocryphal, the difference between angels and devils, there's kind of a thin line that separates them. I mean, if you follow like the traditional Christian teaching, devils, or I guess demons more specifically, are fallen angels. And you read, I don't know if it's considered apocryphal in the Jewish religion or not, but Lilith being Adam's first wife that would not submit to him. So
yeah, you have a lot of fascinating concepts of what a devil is, and what a demon is, and who even actually runs hell and actually controls the demons, is one of these fascinating things, I think, because in a traditional Christian viewpoint, it's interesting how many people who are raised in it don't have like kind of this understanding that hell is where the devil is cast into, but it's not what the devil is like the ruler of. But you have like works of Milton that kind of get filtered into the actual belief systems, and so it becomes better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, and these kind of things get taken as, this is gospel, and it's literally not part of any or certain gospels. And then, like you said, in certain Jewish traditions, there are like levels of hell, and there are different kings of hell, and so then you actually have that possibility though as well. And so it is interesting to see all these different Abrahamic religions coming from the same root, but branch off into these various ideas and concepts, and how much of it is kind of been, I mean, some things have definitely been explored, but there are many things that I think are still relatively unexplored and are fertile ground for horror stories.
Absolutely.
And so this is just one of those. I just used a little sample of it, but it's one of those things that I thought, this is pretty interesting, and I don't see it very often in horror. I've seen the demon Asmodeus referenced in horror movies. I can't think of the names off the top of my head, but I know I've seen it in books and heard his name. But like the actual deed from the book of Tobit of murdering Sarah's husbands night after night, I was like, nobody's really exploited this, and this would be really weird. Actually, this would be a horrifying thing in and of itself. So the idea that I had an idea that kind of coincided with that just enriched for me the idea that maybe I'm onto something here.
Yeah, very interesting concept. Well, the death of Sarita's husband put her at odds with her former in-laws, some of whom were not happy that Frank was marrying a woman of half-Black and Latina descent, and now believe she might have had something to do with Frank's death. There was a very interesting dynamic within Frank's family. Could you tell us a little bit about it, specifically Frank's birth mother, Hera, and his uncle Everett, and what you believe to be the necessary traits of effectively morally gray characters?
I love this question so much because I love these characters a lot. I think Hera, and especially Everett, they were some of the most, I mean, I think all these characters that I wrote in here, they were a lot of fun to write. But Hera's scenes and getting into her mindset and getting into her psyche, and her trying to come to grips with her loss, while at the same time being in this morally gray space, like you said, because she's still feeling so vengeful. She just wants to lash out at someone. And like you said, this is a grief horror story.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of grief, unfortunately, there's stages of grief, and anger is among them. And she's kind of trapped in that. And part of her anger, all of her anger really is encouraging her to blame Sarita in spite of the evidence. And she knows that she has family members that have bad backgrounds and that are offering to do something horrible to Sarita.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not they would be effective or not, who knows? But they're offering to do that. And she's trying to get away from some of those elements, but at the same time, she is also aware that she really wants to blame Sarita for all of this, and she's looking for any reason she can to do it, and eventually kind of devolves into just letting the anger take control no matter what, and blaming other people even unrelated to this, or not directly as related as she thinks Sarita might be. And Everett kind of represents this more stoic version of that, who's a little bit more self-aware. And so you mentioned them being morally gray, and there's people hear that, I think they kind of a lot of times settle in on gray, and it's like, well, there's shades of gray as well, right? Mm-hmm. There's Hera, who's much more in the dark gray, I think. In Everett's a little bit more in the light gray. Mm-hmm. And he's one of my favorite characters to write. And I knew I wanted both of them. They come from, I think, when you try to write something with a little bit of realism or truth to it, their family members have some racism and bigotry to contend with. I knew I didn't want either of them to just be defined by that, because in a nutshell, I think racism and bigotry are inherently boring. Now, it's not, you can write something interesting from it, mm-hmm. just like you can, dealing a deck of cards is inherently boring, but if you know somebody who does card tricks, they can make that one of the most fascinating things you've ever seen. But for me, I wanted to create something with the baseline of it being what's more interesting than just the morally darker area of they're just both plain racist. Mm. And so they get to then enter these different stages of their morally gray atmosphere, where Hera's darkens because of her just pure anger and need to blame someone other than herself. In blaming herself and her guilt, she's probably taking on responsibility for something she had no real control over, but at the same time is finally confronting mistakes she's made in raising her son, when now it's too late to do anything about it, too late to apologize, too late to reconcile all of these different things. Versus Everett, who has, in his light gray attitude, also this more proactive, somewhat dark approach of, I need to do something about this in a different way, which is I want to talk to Sarita directly and appeal to her that I can help you. I know that you're not responsible for this, but if you know who is, and I know some people, I've got a bad background myself, I might know some people, and it allowed me then to get into the gray area, even a little bit, the lighter gray, but a little bit of gray with Sarita herself, when she realizes with Everett, I might have more of a companion here for my dark side than anybody else in my family who is supportive in their own way. And my support network of people, my friends and family, they're all supportive in their own way, but she's also consumed by anger and she wants to get revenge. And she actually finally meets somebody who can appeal to that and is matching that energy. And it's a surprise to her. And that's one of my favorite moments in the story. It was one of my favorite moments in the book to write that, because I came to that realization a little bit as I was writing it, like, oh, her and Everett actually should get along in this different kind of way, because they both want the same thing. And she doesn't have anybody else in her life really who is willing to express that to her, and that she can express to them.
Yeah. Well, Tori was Sarita's best friend and confidant. Tori was interesting because she was very much a witchy woman, as the Eagles would say. This was actually a good thing, because Sarita didn't feel alone or like she was going crazy, because Tori had insight into the spirit world that Sarita had been thrust into. When it came to constructing a confidant, What were the criteria they needed to meet for driving the story forward, and what characteristics did you give Tori to meet those criteria?
Man, one of the things I wanted to make sure Tori, the space she occupied, I wanted her to have a previous relationship. When I knew I wanted there to be a kind of confidant character, somebody who's in touch with the supernatural in a way that can assist Sarita. I didn't want it to be, there's a little bit of a horror cliche sometimes of there's a random person that you go and find, the psychic or the witch or whoever that you go and find. And they're totally unconnected to this. And they really just serve the purpose of you show up and ask them, what can we do? And then they tell you, and then they may or may not be killed by the ultimate evil at some point. But why should we even care? Like, they weren't part of this at all, really, in any way, unless they sometimes had a history with the specific demon. But other than that, they're just kind of a random expert character. We don't even really get a lot of intel as to how they came about this. So I wanted there to be a connection previously with Tori and Sarita, and their own inciting incident of why Tori became the witchy woman, as you put it. And so that was really important for me. And Tori, therefore, they're friends previously. They went to high school together. Tori knew about the guardian angel. She's one of the few people, one of the only people outside of Sarita's direct family members who ever heard of the guardian angel, heard of Angelo. And so when she finally sees Angelo the first time, and they have an incident where it's very affecting to Tori, and we kind of see the divergent paths. And so she ends up also being a little bit of a foil for Sarita. As you mentioned at the beginning, Sarita gets a little bit more reckless, extreme sports, kind of this attitude of, could I be like a weird indirect vigilante at some point? She's wondering, could I get out here and fight criminals through Angelo, like put myself in dangerous situations? And if I know he'll show up to save me and maybe kill the bad guy, then could I do that? And Tori, on the other hand, becomes much more of a student of, okay, the supernatural exists. I don't have a divine protector. I need to be able to protect myself, and I need to figure things out. What else is out here? And so she kind of goes off on her own journey. And in my mind, there's enough there that if there was ever like a special edition of Devils Kill Devils that came out or something, I could write a little small novelette of Tori's venture. For years, I feel like she's just kind of goes into the wilderness a little bit and is in her studies deep involved in meeting people and learning the dangers of everything that's out there. So she emerges with this level of respect for it all that also plays in contrast with Sarita. And I wanted that characteristic as well for her confidant. She needs to be somebody who can tell her, listen, you've got to be careful with a lot of these things. And you've spent your entire life thinking you don't have to be careful about anything. I can get away with anything. I can jump off a mountain and my angel will literally descend and save me if I'm in true danger. And instead, there's a lot of crazy, dangerous stuff out here that you don't necessarily know about. That's the crux of what she's learned. That's what she's pulled away from all of her studies, is all of this is way more dangerous than anybody could possibly realize. And it's very sensitive. It is so, it got to be so precise and exact. And I felt like those were important things in their relationship, to have a true relationship where we get to see how they had their background, but then how their personalities diverge, and then how they kind of balance each other out in that way.
Yeah, I was thinking in terms of the archetypal characters and the hero's journey. I mean, if you're following the hero's journey, a lot of times they pay a visit to a sage, which the sage can just be a wise person or can be magical in some way. So I see what you're saying, giving what would normally be a sage a connection of friendship deepens the narrative.
Yeah, it was, and we end up with like a little bit of a sage character, sort of, but he's just more informational and much more.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Later on.
Yeah.
So I kind of get to have it both ways a little bit, but I feel like Tori's much more important and actually effective as the sage versus the other character I'm speaking of. I won't reveal too much of that because that gets a little bit deeper into the book. But the other character I'm speaking of is a little bit just there to fill in some of the remaining gaps in the background. Their relationship is much more entwined with the villain, and some of that got left on the cutting room floor when we were doing the editing. There was a lot more to that character's past relationship to the villain. And my editor was like, this stuff is awesome. Also, what's the book really about? Is it mainly about Sarita, Hera, and Sella are primary villain. Yes, as great as this stuff is with this other character, maybe save that for like, a sequel or something if we ever get to that. But it the chapters that I had with that were a little bit, maybe a bit much to distract from the primary narrative. But he was another character that I had a lot of I did some research on, and I got to dive into my dilettante historical nerdism and do some fun things with. But yeah, I hope that the sage presence that Tori has is deepened by the fact that they have a previous relationship and friendship, and we see why she becomes the sage that she is.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, the villain of the story is a person named, you said Sella, it's pronounced?
That's the way I've been pronouncing
Okay.
it. I'm not super particular about these things.
Okay, well, I'll just go with Sella. Who is referred to as she, but I hesitate to call her a woman because it seemed that she was in a state of flux regarding the form of her existence. Her plot involves using religion to control the masses, and religion, if taken by the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law, can easily be used as a way to turn spirituality into fascism. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little about the inspiration for the element of the story.
I mean, pretty much just as you said, like the multiple real world examples we unfortunately have of religion being a major motivator for killing masses of people. And this particular character, Sella, as you mentioned, she's referred to as she, but kind of any human designation at all would be abhorrent to her to a certain degree. She has a certain level of not quite hatred, but a little bit of a disgust for humanity, while at the same time understanding that they're necessary for her purposes because of what she is and what human beings mean to her and her kind. But she's also she's got an ambition, a grand ambition, and she feels like whipping people into a religious fervor is the easiest way to accomplish that. And it kind of, I mean, there's examples obviously that predate this for thousands and thousands of years even, but there's sort of a manifest destiny idea in my mind. That one that just sticks to me, the idea of manifest destiny, kind of divinely inspired to take over this land that was previously occupied by other people.
Mm-hmm.
Because simple greed, if you just want to be purely, just root level selfish about it to a degree that I would say is beyond morally gray and fully into the black, what more motivation do you really need than, hey, this is a huge amount of fertile land. Let's just kick everybody else off of it and take it for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some understanding deeper there that we need to have some kind of moral justification for this. We need to tell people, actually, this is your divine right. And it kind of also goes into like divine right of kings. For thousands of years, people have justified, well, the reason why I'm able to rule over these people is because obviously I'm favored by a higher power. And again, the idea, what more real idea do you need to be like, listen, I'm the king and them's the breaks. And so I get to rule over everybody and I get all the perks, and I get that it's maybe imbalanced or unfair, but what do you want me to do? Not enjoy all of this? I'm having a great time. But somewhere inside of us, something deep inside of us needs to be motivated by something larger, some idea that actually, no, I'm serving a higher purpose. I'm doing something more important. I'm ordained by God, by whatever being I believe in, to do these things, and therefore it's justified to do something horrible maybe to other people. And so she, being a very, very old being that she is herself, Sella, is very aware of this. And there are more primordial gods that she's also aware of because of her unique vision of the reality in the universe. And she sees how basically indifferent they are, and it's made them sluggish. And she contrasts that with, how can I make sure that the people that I want, that the beings, not people, but the things that I want to do my bidding, how do I make sure that they're not sluggish? We need to whip them into a frenzy, let them believe in something. And so she's able to use religion to do that. I need to whip them into the frenzy, make them believe in something, and then motivate them with the idea that we are divinely inspired. We are going to go on a crusade. Obviously, the crusade's another great example of this and another bit of an inspiration for this. We're going to basically go on a crusade, and as motivation to eradicate as many of the people and then subjugate the others that we can.
Yeah. Well, Frank's mother, Hera, really struck a chord with me because she is a carbon copy of one of my family members in the realm of addiction. And addiction is so ubiquitous that most people have at least one, sometimes multiple people in their immediate family who have issues with addiction. I myself have issues with addiction, and even though I haven't had a drink in 12 years, believe me, my addictive nature manifests in many other areas of my life. So, what feedback have you received about Hera's character, and how do you personally feel about her character now compared to when you wrote her?
Great question. The feedback so far has been positive. It's been interesting too, because some of my earliest editorial feedback, a lot of it was in a good way, but they were like, when Hera would do or say certain things, it was like, man, I can't stand her, which was kind of my point. I want you to feel a certain way. But then by the end, they were like, I kind of felt for her a little bit too. And I was like, yeah, that's the objective too. I want you to feel at least a little bit of commiseration with her. And so that was the feedback I received, and it landed where I wanted it to. And I'm hoping that that's how everybody else ends up feeling about it, the way I felt about the character as well. From the beginning of writing her, I knew that I wanted her to feel stubborn and a little bit unlikable. She is one of the co-villains after all. And I want her descent, however, to feel like you're still rooting for her not to quite go over the edge. And so it's a little bit at a time where you're realizing she can pull herself back, but a little bit of that addictive personality, like you said, is what proves to be her downfall. And I don't know if I've ever quite been fully addicted to anything, but I know I have a very indulgent personality, and I can spiral into certain things sometimes and end up having to climb out of it. And then you replace certain, things with something else. And so for her, she has alcoholism to the extent that, you read about some people that have alcoholism to the point that basically alcohol loses the effect on them that it once had, and they can't get that high anymore, basically, or that inebriation is kind of, they have to drink so much that they basically end up just blacking out, and it kind of doesn't do anything for them. But she's able to find this new anger that is making her feel alive again in a different way. And she's also pursued it through sex and some other things, and maybe these things aren't really giving her what she needs. But in a perverse way, the death of her son gives her an outlet of anger, and this builds and builds until she gets to a point where she's willing to kill entirely innocent, uninvolved people to get what she wants, because now she has this new outlet that I think her addiction has kind of made her more susceptible to, in that she can really fully indulge in the anger. And by the end of, when I got to the point of writing that, I didn't quite feel bad for her anymore, but I did feel like I had hopefully written a character where there are spots where you can feel bad, and there are spots where she's still feeling bad about what she's becoming, because she knows this is to a certain degree wrong, but she also knows this is what's making her feel something again right now, since it's so far gone as far as how far she's descended, but it's still a feeling, it's something. And I think that by the end, with the final scenes that she has, I wrote them in a way to kind of give her a moment of, I don't know, for me it was cathartic at the end when I get to my final moments with Hera, which is so important in the final confrontation she has. I felt like that was not originally what I had in mind for the book when I first envisioned it. But as I was writing it, I was like, this makes the most sense to end it this way, with the way Hera and Sarita finally kind of come together. And Hera gets to have some moments where she, you can remember what this was all about for her, where you can remember this was all about her grief for her son. And that's what's still most important to her. And it's not handled in a a proper way at all or a healthy way at all. But it is still what motivated her. And I was really happy with coming to that conclusion for her.
Well, just kind of an aside, I suppose. It seemed like Hera's primary addiction was gambling. And then the alcohol goes with gambling because you drink for free when you gamble. And then when you get drunk, you want to have sex. So maybe there's some sex in there too. But it seemed like primary that got her in trouble was gambling. So was Hera named after Hera's casino?
That was entirely coincidental.
Okay. Because I was like, I have never met a Hera before, but why does that name sound familiar?
That was entirely coincidental. I got that name Hera because I knew a girl in high school basically named Hera, and for whatever reason that popped into my head when I was coming up with this character. and I was like, you know what, it's pretty unique. It's kind of memorable.
Mm-hmm.
It's memorable, and yet, like you said, it's a little bit unique. There's not too many Heras in the world, and yet it's not like complicated to say.
Yeah.
And so like it's one of those things you want a name that like is it's going to land with people, stick hopefully in their mind, but it's not like how do you even pronounce that? Everybody knows how to pronounce Harris.
Mm.
And so then the coincidental match with the casino that just kind of worked out that way.
All right. I have a tendency to read too much into things, but I was like, I wonder if I picked that out. I just have to check.
No, that's a good connection to make, even if it's unintentional on my part. It makes sense.
Yeah. Well, as Sarita's friend Tori investigates Sarita's former husband Frank's murder, she naturally approaches it from a spiritual angle, looking through apocryphal religious texts and coming across the story of Sarah and Asmodeus. I've always been interested in apocryphal literature and the reasons why certain texts were relegated to being apocryphal. There are many books of the Bible that were rendered apocryphal at the Council of Nicaea by religious men with political axes to grind, which is why we find little in the way of Gnostic Christianity. What were some of the apocryphal works that you researched? I mean, you mentioned Tobit, but what are some of the others? And if it won't reveal any spoilers, could you tell us what story elements you employed?
Man, so primarily, like you said, the Book of Tobit. There's another one that I've always been fascinated with, the Book of Enoch. And I think that's where you get into like the idea of the Nephilim.
I think that's the main Gnostic text, is it not?
Yes. Yeah. And that's one of the big ones that a lot of people have looked into. And that kind of, I didn't take any, I think, direct story elements from it, but the idea of really opening my mind up to what is and isn't demonic or divine, and kind of the idea of like it's hard to really nail these things down and define them, and kind of being able to reimagine and recontextualize some of these things. I've read that one before, and I'm hoping maybe I can like actually write something more directly inspired by that at some point. But I do think like the spirit of that pervades Devils Kill Devils, because the style of the monsters in the book, it's a little bit somewhat undefined. The devils in the book ultimately have multiple characteristics of different kind of inspirations that I had. But I do think kind of this idea of things that are demonic. And like I said, I've also, read, gosh, what is it? Is it I forget what it's called. It's not the Book of Solomon. I forget.
The Lesser Key of Solomon?
Yes. Yeah. That also influenced some of the idea of the dangers of magic in the book. And so you have a lot of those kind of different fun, I think people like us, maybe fun to read. For other people, it's very serious business. So I don't want to sound disrespectful. Yeah. But for me, it's like fascinating. Yeah, I think is a inoffensive way of putting it. Fascinating read that gives you all these ideas, and it's like a fountain of ideas for like, wow, like, I mean, even the Bible itself, really, when you dig into it, it's not as straightforward, quite as black and white morality wise as I think people who even adhere to the religion but maybe haven't actually read the text presume it to be. There are a lot of different moments where you're like, well, it's I mean, I didn't put it in the book, but there are at least, I think, 2 instances in the Bible, depending on your translation. And if you're reading, the King James, I think says like an evil spirit from the Lord visited someone.
Like like Passover, the angel of death that killed the firstborn.
There's that. And then I think it actually visits Saul. I believe it's Saul, King Saul, precursor to David, if I'm not mistaken. And I need to go back and I've got it bookmarked somewhere because I've gone in and read, and I just find it fascinating that the text literally says evil spirit from the Lord. It's not even like an interpretation. And so then people have to kind of recontextualize that. People that don't want to just say, well, obviously God doesn't employ evil spirits. So what they were really trying to say. And it's very interesting to read people try to explain that, while at the same time, some of them are very much the, hey, King James version of the Bible is the divinely inspired version of the Bible, and this is the one that is only supposed to be read, and every other interpretation is not as accurate. And yet then at the same time, well, having said that, there's this one little inaccuracy here, because it's God obviously wouldn't truly employ an evil spirit, but it's like, well, what if he does? What if God is out there and he's like, listen, I created all this. All of this is at my disposal. And if I need to use a demon to do my bidding, because this is the dirty work I need to get done, and I don't want my angels to get their hands dirty or their wings dirty, so to speak, all these kind of things. It's just all those elements, whether it's apocryphal or even sometimes stuff that's actually in the Bible, I think kind of permeated the story to some extent, because ultimately what we have is somebody who's trying to play God to a certain extent, our main villain, and wants to employ whatever kind of agents they can. And so while she has this disgusted view of humankind, her main plan of attack is to use a human being ultimately as a way, when she needs a backup plan, Sella needs a backup plan, she approaches Hera and is like, I need you to actually do certain things for me, even though I'm disgusted with humankind. I don't like these things, but I don't want my flock to actually, and part of it is because of the nature of the plan, but it's like, I don't want my flock to get involved in this act. They can't be here. So I need to use my version of an evil spirit to actually enact my plan. And it's just all these kind of ideas wrapped up in my head, and like trying to put them on the page in a way that's effective and efficient. And this book, even more than The Spite House, a lot of stuff got edited out. I thought it was really fun, but I thought my editor made a good point of like, hey, some of these religious asides and other things, again, like the heart of the story.
You need to make an annotated version to where you have all that stuff in the margins.
I would actually love to, because it was just fun researching all these different things and these ideas. And I so many times wanted to say, this is what this person's thinking. And because of the nature of Sella, you kind of get to, you always want to be careful about your exposition. I never like to say avoid anything. Everything's a tool in the writer's toolbox. Exposition can be used effectively, just don't use it poorly. And so when you have a character like her, though, who's very clearly like kind of in love with herself a little bit and in love with her own voice, you have this opportunity to like, oh, I can have her just kind of say what she feels and think what she feels in this kind of flowing, eloquent way, because this is just in her character. And some of that was left in, and a lot of it was also taken out, because it was like, hey, this is really fun and interesting stuff. And especially because she's viewed thousands of years of history, and she's walked, there are scenes I took out where she's walked through battlefields and she's just like observing, and people, she's like this specter that we find out like throughout history. There's whispers of her in all the different nations, because she's traveled all over these places, because anytime she just can sense war is going to take place, and she can learn from the folly of humanity and how much they love to slaughter each other, she appears. And while she's there, she's like this lone, strange figure on these battlefields, and men would write, soldiers that survived would write diary entries about her, and she would go visit them to every once in a while, just to prove that she was real, and just kind of taunt them about it, so her story would spread. It was all this stuff that I absolutely loved. And my editor was like, this is really cool, this is really fun. We can't have a whole chapter of this.
Can't we just make it an epic fantasy, for the love of God?
I mean, and to a certain degree, this was an epic horror fantasy. Her sections of it were kind of like epic horror fantasy. And I think the only way that would have like ultimately worked, I would have had to like even expand on that and like make it like a huge, like basically division of, these are the flashback moments, and these are the back to the present moments.
Mhm.
And so, anyway, all that to say, a lot of the studies of the Apocrypha in the Book of Tobit and other books of the Bible and the Goetia and all these different things, especially with relation to Sela, in my mind, if not explicitly on the page. And sometimes the stuff that would have been explicitly on the page, unfortunately, well, I don't want to say unfortunately, there were reasons for it, but I got edited out.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, Hera becomes the co-villain. She becomes an intricate part of the story through that way. And she's brought into the fold of evil. It doesn't seem so much willingly, but as a result of like an addict's apathy.
Mm-hmm.
Was she chosen because her mind was so malleable and she was usually in the physically weakened state of intoxication? Or was it a little bit deeper than that? Can you kind of expand on your choice of Hera to succumb to evil?
Man, great question. I mean, part of it is Sela targets her because Sela's a little bit desperate.
Hmm.
Her plans have gone off the rails a little bit, and she's been so overconfident and she has so much hubris about her master plan. She thought she accounted for every possibility, save for basically what amounts to a betrayal from somebody she thought was one of her faithful, even though there's the reason for it is also her own fault in an unexpected way. So she targets Hera, who seems like a very easy target to her, and still takes a little bit of convincing, coercion, intimidation.
Mm-hmm.
There's a combination of things. She has to kind of get overwhelmed. She's undergoing, I think, a certain sensory overload. And while Sel also knows that she's going to be in a weakened state, like you said, she's capable of being manipulated. She's also left with a little bit of, you have no choice. Or, she probably does have a choice, but the way Sela tries to coerce her is basically putting her in a no-win situation. Shows, Sela demonstrates how evil she can be. And there's one of, I think, 3 different massacre scenes that I wrote in this book, which, again, I'm excited about it, but I do wonder how people are going to receive it because there's like nothing like that in the Spite House. And then, I knew a lot of people were like, oh, I really like the Spite House. It's horror, but it's kind of, there's not as much blood and guts. And I'm like, well, there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit more carnage.
Yeah.
There's 3 different massacres. And this is like the easiest one on the senses that I wrote, that first one with Sela. But she does that just as a way of like, again, kind of sensory overload. You're already grieving your son and you've already got this addictive personality. You got this addiction problem. You're in an inebriated state. You've been drinking all night. And suddenly I've thrust you into these even more bizarre situations. And I'm revealing to you parts of the world you didn't even know existed. You don't know that these evil beings exist and the capabilities that we have and how invincible I can appear. And Sela demonstrates all that. And then how evil I can be. But she's also in a subtle way. Well, it's hard to say subtle when you're talking about a massacre, but in her, she doesn't directly say it quite like that initially, but she's also demonstrating for her, this is also how powerful you could be. And imagine if you could have this kind of power and use it for your own purposes and your own vengeance. And now it becomes the temptation. And it's very much, again, kind of biblical inspirations. It's, the devil tempting Jesus in the desert. They're in a desert setting,
Mm-hmm.
and Sela is effectively a devil.
Oh.
And she is tempting Hera in the desert. Now, Hera...
See, I caught on to Hera the casino, but I didn't catch on to the temptation in the desert. God, darn it. All right.
Well, there's very much that, like the temptation in the desert. Oh, like if I'm getting blurry here, I don't think you guys can see it, but like I have this painting behind me of a face.
Uh-huh.
I might be cropped out in your thing, but there's this painting behind me, and it has like a little bit of a face.
Yeah, your autofocus is every once in a while going to that and then coming back to you. So
yes, my camera mistakes.
It's actually kind of creepy because it's like it's trying to slowly get closer to you.
it is a little bit weird because I'll be talking about horror and something, and then it's like all of a sudden,
just go with it.
I know, right? I'm like, just I don't know if you guys can always see it, so but I wasn't sure if it like cropped out, so now it just looks like my camera just freaks out on me sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I do think that there was that element that I wanted to incorporate with the temptation in the desert and kind of juxtapose the idea of like, this is the dark savior by Hera's standard, weirdly enough. And she is tempting this person in the desert. And it's, even tried to mirror the whole, you're starving turn this rock into bread. And Jesus rejects that. And then, in my story, Sela offers something much more wicked for Hera to consume as part of her final transformation to go to the dark side. But I wanted to show that, like, she is susceptible to this, but it's also, I wanted it to hopefully be something where people can feel like it's impossible to imagine what you would do in that situation because it's so over the top and, unrealistic. But at the same time, I kind of want you to wonder, like, if I was going through all of this, how easy would it be to just say, you know what, all I want to do right now is feel powerful. I'll go with anything right now that'll just make me feel powerful. And at the end, all of her addiction and weaknesses and guilt and all these other things that she's going through are what help make her succumb that much easier. But it's also just, I think, pretty easy overall, even if you have a strong strength of will. If you're going through all these things and you're just like maybe at your weakest point and just thinking, I just want to feel power. I just want to feel like I'm been opened up to this incredible, ridiculous, over the top new reality that I can't even fathom, that I would have never guessed is possible. And I've seen horrible acts done to people before my eyes, and I'm terrified. But this thing is offering me empowerment. I could just take that, right? Isn't that the easy way out?
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of is her ultimate driving, force. It's a little bit of taking the easy way out.
Gotcha. Well, another integral character, Sarita's brother, David. The first appearance of Angelo was during an accident involving Sarita where, due to David's age and circumstances, he was unable to help his sister, requiring Angelo to intervene. It seemed that not only love for his sister drove him to protect her, but also a feeling of failure as a man and a resentment of Angelo for making him look bad. David, ironically or not so ironically, joined the Coast Guard. Was his choice of occupation a way to make up for his perceived shortcomings? And could you expand on what made David tick?
Absolutely. He joined the Coast Guard. He couldn't save his sister from drowning that time. It needed divine intervention. And while he is grateful for that, there is also a sense of failure, even from that young age. And that is, I think, a thing, like you said, failure as a man, that is a very odd place we sometimes occupy as men, especially because his inability, his failure is like literally, I had my hand, I was able to hold her. It's kind of like the movie Cliffhanger, that harrowing scene in the opening of Cliffhanger. And it's like holding her by the hand, just hold on, and grip strength, like when I do manage to work out, it's one of the things the guys I follow online, they're always talking about that these days more than I remember hearing it as a child. Grip strength, this is like one of the true indicators of strength. Don't overlook it. And it kind of goes back into like having a good, strong, firm handshake, and like this kind of odd place that we place with, as men, our hands, strong hands, right? Yeah. And this is a weird connection to make, but it's always been, it's one of the few scenes I can like just think of, and it like makes me just feel immediately like sad.
Yeah.
Is the never-ending story, the rock biter, for anybody who's familiar with that, and the nothing, this giant black hole of nothing that is sucking up the entire universe that he occupies in this fantasy world. They come back and visit him later, and he finds out his friends were sucked up into the nothing. And he says, I had them in my hands and I couldn't hold on. And he's like lamenting, and he says, they look like good, strong hands, don't they? And I actually referenced that basically twice. Like there's an inspiration for that basically twice in the book. From David, his hands not being strong enough to hold on to his sister. And then there's a scene later on with Uncle Everett looking at his hands. And he doesn't say that, but he's looking at his hands, and he's suffered something horrible for him, and feeling again that failure as a man, despite it being irrational. David's like, I couldn't hold on tight enough. And it's like, you were a kid fighting forces of nature. Like you literally can't win. Like, that's not about, you just let it go. Just, seek some therapy. But famously, we don't like to seek therapy as men a lot of the time. Everett, similar situation. And his is an immediate aftermath of trauma. And, he's dealing with that. So he's not going to think rationally. But it's like, again, you're fighting against something that is well beyond your capacity to actually win this fight. And he is still nonetheless blaming himself and looking at his hands and thinking, I just wasn't strong enough. And so that was a huge motivator for David. And so that definitely plays into it. And one of the things I hope I accomplished, similar to with Tori, and really with a lot of, the primary side characters, similar with Everett as well. I like to think, hopefully, that I've written something where my side characters, you could picture them having their own book. I want you to feel like I would read an entire at least a small novella, something, 150 pages about this character's journey.
Better Call Saul.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I want you to feel like, man, I wonder what else was going on here. And so David goes on to become a Coast Guard rescue diver, and he's stationed in Alaska. And, the idea of like his journey, my sister, this happened to her, and this is why I became this. And then I find out later on as an adult, I'm kind of blaming myself because this angel that I thought was an angel is actually something else, an evil. And he's now got renewed guilt about maybe if I had just saved her that time when I was a kid, the angel doesn't even show up and none of this happens. I could have avoided all of this if I had just been strong enough. So now it returns again to his irrational guilt. And so all of that kind of plays into it. And I'm, like you said, kind of the Better Call Saul situation. I hope people connect to the character through these motivations that I've created for him in a way that makes you feel like, man, like not only do I feel that motivation, I would read more about it. If, I feel like that's a testament to a great secondary character and side characters. If you feel like I would actually be willing to spend another 50, 100 pages, a small story here, just getting to know them a little bit more. And obviously you can't put those things in the book when you're trying to keep the main narrative going, but I would want to pique your curiosity. And, this is like what births fan fiction and things like that, is people wanting to think, man, I wonder what more could be done with a character like this. And so that's a big part of what I feel like the motivation for trying to create David is hopefully an interesting character is.
Yeah. Well, this next question, I don't know, it might be a little too spoilery, so feel free to pass. But as I mentioned in the introduction, one of the many elements of this story is creature horror. The creatures are broadly referred to as devils, but they have stages of development where they can be classified as something specific, like vampires. Could you explain the essence of these creatures?
Sure. And I don't think that's too spoilery because my publisher has basically opened up the whole vampire thing. They have it listed as a vampire novel in their on their pages. And it's one of those things I didn't want it to feel like the whole story hinges on this big twist of the vampiric nature of these things. So it's one of those things I'm playing close to the vest early on, but it's more for the purposes of the characters need time to grow into learning what these things are, just kind of as an organic element of the story. But the nature of them as well, in terms of just being vampires, I mean, I did a lot of research on this as well. I've got a book here, the Vampire Encyclopedia. I put a lot of this stuff in my author notes, where at the end of the book, there are old folkloric tales of vampires that I read. There's a author named Montague Summers, who was also a man of the cloth, and he wrote about vampires, a book called The Vampire, His Kith and Kin, and he very much lays out that these are demons. There are vampiric creatures among us. They are also demonic. And at the same time, when you read a lot of this old vampire lore, there's like not a lot of distinction there's less distinction than you would think between vampires, witches, and ghosts even, and devils. It's kind of like a natural chain of events almost. It's like you see a ghost, it might actually be a vampire. There are a lot of old stories of vampires when they emerge from the grave. It's not like the zombie style, I'm actually bursting from the grave. It's just like mystically, they're like a mist and they come out of the grave and they're very like almost like an apparition. And they return to the grave in a similar fashion. Their grave is undisturbed. So there are a lot of stories like that. A lot of stories where basically to become a vampire, you have to engage in witchcraft or sell your soul to the devil or be excommunicated from the church after having been a man of the cloth. There were all these fascinating stories that I was reading about vampires that tied them in this early lore to Satanism or pagan devilry. And I just thought, I've got really a great opportunity here to do something not different, obviously, because it's hundreds of years old, in some cases over 1,000 years old, all these beliefs. But, the multiple vampire encyclopedias I'm reading and all this old lore, I was like, there's something really cool here you can do with different styles of vampirism. And so, again, I have a little bit of an indulgent personality. I kind of want to have as much of this as I can in my story. So I also was like, there are anime movies with cool vampires that I wanted to do something, interesting with. And video games I've played with cool vampires, and old movies with interesting vampire lore in them that I wanted to play with as well. So I kind of did a little bit of a mix and match of all of these, and old books as well that have them. And, as I'm researching it, I went and found out that a lot of what we got from Dracula, for instance, from Bram Stoker, if you read up on some of the things that he has Dracula do, some of the shape-shifting, for instance, potentially, doesn't really seem to exist in some of the vampire lore that was probably available to him and that he would have been familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
But it was available in werewolf lore that he would have been familiar with. So he was like, what if Dracula just kind of is a little bit of a werewolf as well? And so even from that, like from the one of the most inspirational texts in literature of all time, especially for this specific creature, he's willing to step outside of what would have been the confines presented to him at the time. And so I was feeling inspired by that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the primary motivation, the idea that fascinated me so much, was how much of the religion aspect was involved with vampirism, and how I think that that's just more interesting than maybe where we've landed now. And certainly a lot of stories that exist now that use more of these traditions, the kind of newer traditions, I guess I should say, are still fascinating and wonderful and interesting, where it's just like more of a vampire bite and you become a vampire. And it's more straightforward like that. And that's the only path, those kind of things. But I was like, man, like when you look at some of these and it's like, oh no, you have to engage in certain witchcraft, and you have to, if it is drinking blood, it's drinking a certain kind of like a Christian's blood in front of a church, and, on a particular saint's day, and like all these different things that I'm reading. And I was just like, man, like this is so interesting. What if these creatures are not just, kind of the movie monster style vampire? What if it's more explicitly demonic? And I can tie that into my overall religious horror angle that I'm going for here. I just thought that would make them fascinating in a new way. And then the other big thing, I just wanted them to be terrifying and intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
I really wanted them to feel, I wanted it to feel like the idea of killing a vampire is not nearly as simple as it's kind of been presented in a lot of newer media. And even going back to, like I said before, Dracula, the book, which I love, but the ultimate showdown with Dracula, I always felt was, I don't want to say anticlimactic. It does take a team of them to kill him, but it just kind of boils down to they finally cornered him and overpowered him because of superior numbers. One of their team dies, the Texan, of course.
Yeah.
but at the end, it's like, it's a relatively easy kill, for the main villain of the story. And I was like, what if it's like way worse? And I, again, using a video game reference, but I was like, there's a scene in the book that is specifically kind of inspired by this idea of, you sometimes play a game and it's like you have a team of people and you go after a boss fight, and it turns out you guys were not even close to prepared. And you thought, yeah, we're ready to do this. And then you get wiped out. It's like, oh my God, we did not have the ammunition to go into this dungeon yet. And that is literally what that scene, the inner, because I've been in that moment, and there is a little bit of a panic. And it's, it doesn't make any sense. You're playing something that has no real effect on you, but there is this sense of, oh God, like, that guy's already dead. my team member here is already dead. They did one attack. None of us are going to survive this. We made a horrible mistake, and we're way too deep in the dungeon to leave.
Mistakes were made.
Mistakes were made. And so I definitely wanted to kind of convey some of that energy, because I still wanted to also be a pretty fun book. And I hope I conveyed that as well. And like, I want all of those things to come together in the sense of what these creatures are, these big, intimidating, demonic, vampiric monsters that at the same time are not nearly at the top of the food chain of things that could be out there that are a threat to humanity.
Yeah. Well, we have alluded to him a few times throughout the show. Another very interesting character, of course, and probably the most morally gray, but as you were saying, on the spectrum, more on the lighter gray side, is Uncle Everett. He was a tough guy, but also a peacemaker. He ran afoul of the law, but was very intelligent. He had zero tolerance for disrespect, but was also reasonable. And to me, was the embodiment of an anti-hero. What inspired you to create a character with such contradictory traits, and what role did he play in Sarita's emotional development?
Man, great question. He was one of my favorite characters to write, absolutely. A lot of kind of the inspiration for that is like this the country noir kind of anti-heroes, like you mentioned. Like if you read something like, I've got it over here, what is it? Daniel Woodrell, I believe, is the author of, I've got the Bayou trilogy over here, but I believe he wrote Winter's Bone as well. And there's a character in there named Teardrop, and he's an uncle in that story as well. And he's one of the more fascinating characters I think I've ever seen in a film or read in a book. And he's, just because he's intimidating, he's even intimidating to the people that he loves. But he's also, like you said, all these other characteristics. He's intelligent. He can investigate. He's got his flaws, but he's at the end of the day going to be there for his family no matter what. And that is like his ultimate objective. And so I had that in mind with Everett. I wanted it to be a certain feature of him where you see him and there's an immediate stereotype that's going to jump to mind. And again, then I just thought, what's more interesting for him to kind of embody that stereotype or have some traits that dispel a little bit of that. And we can actually find out that there's logic and reason for why he is this way. And it turns out, because of some of his upbringing, which we get just kind of allusions to, he's a little bit more susceptible to the lifestyle that he chose because of some of the influences in his family, but he's also able to see the bad examples and how doing it the stupid way will lead you to your downfall. And he's very self-aware. He has this minor speech toward the end of the book where he basically just talks about reinforcing a notion in the book, the reliability of doing the wrong thing, where it's the wrong thing, like being a criminal, what have you, but it at least won't let you down if you're not stupid. If you're a bank robber, the probable outcomes. So you can't be surprised. If you're working a 9 to 5 and you're trying to do things the right way, a corporation can still gut you. You could be working for Enron and you're like, I was doing everything right and I've saved all my money and now my entire life savings is obliterated. And what do I do now? And that level of betrayal is much more magnified when it's something like that versus if I was working within the mafia or something, and it's like they take you on a boat and they got to put a bullet in the back of your head because they think you're a snitch, even if you weren't one. You can't be too surprised. You know what you're involved in. This is the life we chose, as is stated in certain things, and his awareness of that, and again, kind of drawing on that country noir. The stories like the book The Devil All the Time as well, which I really like. I mean, like just a lot of old noir novels as well that I really like. I wanted this character of, again, he could maybe be the leader of his own story. And there's a part of me that wants to write a short story about what happens after this, because I actually think he's probably not going to be long for this world. I guess it's not too much of a spoiler to allude to the idea that he might survive this book. But now he knows that these monsters are out here and he has cause for revenge. And how does a man like that process the idea of, I want to go on the offensive now and seek revenge, but I also know that like I can't do that alone. And even if I have like a pack with me, even if I have 20 people with me, that probably isn't going to be enough to even kill one of these things. So then what does he pursue? And how does his resourcefulness turn him into If you wanted to try to become a demon hunter, vampire hunter, how would that actually, what would that look like with a character like him?
Mhm.
And so again, I just kind of want to present this idea of like, what's more interesting? You don't get those interesting elements, this idea of what more could he be and he become, if it's just like, yeah, he's the tattooed racist uncle. And that's it. That just doesn't give you the same, I feel like, opportunities to, even if I don't do it, if somebody else writes a story completely unrelated to mine, but it feels inspired the same way I felt inspired by the character of Teardrop and all these other characters. Maybe somebody hopefully reads Everett's story and feels inspired, and they're like, what if I write my own version of this, where it's like my demon hunter is like the grizzled old guy who's suffered some different tragedy and has all his flaws and is morally light gray, but also really sensible and aging and wearing down, and probably knows he can't keep doing this. So does he try to recruit new people? And all these different ideas that are there. I really wanted to just write somebody and present a character that can give you these new ideas, knowing that I can't put them all in this book. But that's part of, I think, the beauty of reading a really good book, is feeling like, man, I want to know more about this person, and I could imagine myself writing something inspired by this without needing this book necessarily to be the one that gives me all that additional background and future storytelling.
Gotcha. Well, at a pivotal moment in the story, Sarita meets a woman named, is it Myra or Mira?
Myra.
Myra. Okay. Myra is what you might call a soldier. Myra, over a period of time, slowly reveals what is happening and all of their roles in it. And I've got to say, the backstories for the characters and the entire history of the characters and setting of the story would make the writer of an epic fantasy green with envy, as I've already mentioned. Surely you didn't pants this. Surely this was meticulously outlined. Am I wrong? Or can you kind of expand on the history and the setting and characters that you created?
So I am much more of a pantser than a plotter.
Oh, wow.
Having said that, I mean, I have a lot of the outlines and stuff just living up here. I don't do very much outline writing at all. I'll give myself little general notes
Uh-huh.
to make sure that I don't get off too far off the path, but then I leave myself a lot of wiggle room to just go where the story takes me. Like I said, the original ending for this was in a very different place, but then as the story went along, it was like, no, this is what makes way more sense. And I know that even if you write an outline, you have the flexibility to do that. But for me personally, as much as I would love to be an outliner, because I think it actually is much more efficient and probably less stressful, when I've tried it, I get trapped in like just writing an outline almost forever, it feels like, and I can't actually progress on the book. I'm just like constantly, before I get started. I mean, in my headspace. It's very weird. If I don't have the right title even to begin with, I can't move past that. And so I have a lot of things that I get hung up on, and outlining would be one of those things if I was really embracing it fully. So I've struggled with it, and hopefully maybe one day I can figure out a way to do it better. But I'll take the compliment. Absolutely. I appreciate that. If it feels like it had to have been outlined, and I know that I pantsed it mostly, I'll absolutely appreciate and thank you for that compliment.
Sure.
Yeah, I wanted the background for these characters again to give you a sense, just a tease. I wanted to live in your imagination a little bit. So Myra has this tragic backstory, and so many of the other people that are involved in this compound that eventually Sarita is brought to. There's a lot of suggestions of the tragic backstories, and Myra's specifically. We get hints at it and teases at it, and I wanted to just give you just a taste of it. But the specifics of it, I knew certain, I knew the general idea of, okay, Myra was involved within her little new family, a tragic incident, and I knew the general idea of that. Again, a lot of that changed. But I was in the middle of writing that when I realized she needs a little bit more of just a little bit of a punch up on her like specific story. I was already going to hint at this is the reason why people are here, but I wanted a little punch up. And there was this idea of like, what could be the scariest way to do that? And I mean, like the imagery I hope I convey on that is, in my mind, it's one of the scariest scenes within a big scary scene. But the little bit of like her direct backstory and her being a child and her first encounter with these beings and where she was and what she heard. When I was writing that, when I came up with it kind of on the fly, I was like, this is for me like maybe one of the scariest things I've ever written, just the idea of it. And one of the bloodless moments, strangely enough. In the middle of like a lot of carnage is a bloodless moment, but just the imagery and the idea of it, I thought this paints a great picture for what has defined her as a character, like you said, as a soldier, surviving this, knowing what these things are, and kind of having a more practical mind, but also an appropriate fear of these almost unkillable or very hard to kill monstrosities. And so, sometimes you just, if you're, I'm sure even if I outlined it, I probably could have stumbled into that. But I know that with my style, you happen into some of these cool things as you're kind of on the fly writing. And I was fortunate enough to have that and then be able to just to go with it.
Awesome. Well, probably the final character I wanted to reveal and talk about was when Myra brings Sarita back to a secure location where she meets a man named, dare I say his name? You sounded very cagey about it earlier.
Oh no, yeah, we can go. We're if you're listening this deep, it's like a reward. If you've listened to the entire, show. Let's talk about him. Sure.
Okay, she meets a man named Z. Z was a man who had seen the error of his ways, and not only did he attempt to help, but he also took measures to make himself harmless to those he was trying to protect. Was he based on any mythical figure, specifically one with the traits of helping those he was designed to prey upon, and in the same way intentionally making himself less of a threat?
Man, I love this question. So how do I answer this? He was not based on a mythical figure.
Okay.
And there was more of this in the original book. Again, a lot of stuff we had
the annotated version that is yet to be written.
Oh, man. Because his name is Z, which is short for Epizelus. Epizelus, from what I've read, who knows if this is exactly true, it's ancient history, but he's the first recorded incident of PTSD.
Oh.
He was a Greek soldier fighting, I think it was the Persians, and one of his beloved comrades in battle, his closest comrade, friend, partner, whatever they may have been, was, I think from what I read, basically like Epizelus saw him get his head cleaved by a Persian weapon right in front of him. And it shocked him so badly that he went blind on the spot, just psychosomatic blindness. I've seen something so horrible, my sight vacated me.
Wow.
And I think it's Herodotus that captured that. And he's gone blind. And then he's one of the earliest recruits that Sella in her many journeys. She was again on the battlefield. She witnessed this. She follows him and she's like, I can recruit you. I can give you back not just your sight. If you follow me, I can not only give you back your sight, I can give you sight that of things that you've never even seen before, things that you would never even have access to. And so then she manipulates him. He passes her many trials and becomes her most trusted ally. And there was a lot more of this originally in the book. And she feels most betrayed by him when he eventually comes to realize she's going to basically do unto others what happened to me. Like I suffered this extraordinary trauma and, doing what I thought was right, being a soldier for others. And I suffered this horrible trauma and someone I love, I saw them murdered and they're slaughtered in front of me. And this is going to become eventually what she does to others. And I have to leave this. And not only do I have to leave this, I have to make it to where I'm no longer in a position to ever inflict the kind of trauma that's been put upon me on anybody else. I don't want anybody else to, I remember what it was like to go blind from seeing this. And so I took that historical figure and then obviously added all these fictional components to it. And that was like the larger scope of what his motivation was. And I think I have like a vague allusion to it that still remains in the book, but it was like much more explicitly spelled out. Again, it's a little bit of a showstopper where it's like this sidebar sage character who's literally kind of in the much more traditional under the mountain, surrounded by candles or flames. And it's like a library of text behind him. And this is how he knows all this stuff. And it's like, well, I didn't want him to still feel like that ordinary, or not ordinary, but more conventional sage type character. And having him be Epizelus, I just thought would be like, this is going to be a lot more interesting. Unfortunately, like I say, it's kind of for a specific type of I think horror nerd would have gotten a kick out of it, like me, horror and history nerd, kind of at the same time. Like, this is one of the coolest things, but didn't make the final cuts of the edit, and so we only have a little bit of allusion to it. So instead of a mythical figure, it's a historical figure, an actual historical figure, the first person to ever have an account of their PTSD documented in the ancient histories.
One of the entire book, I think I can say this, this is going to sound odd, the scariest scene, for some reason, I don't know if it was the setting, the way you worded it. It was when they first went down to meet Z, and I forget the context of their conversation at the time, but he stood up, put his hands on the table, and leaned forward like a snake that was about to strike. I don't know what you said exactly. I was just literally like, oh my God. My skin started crawling, and I was like, please don't let him do anything. Please don't let him do anything.
Well, he's also, I mean, I'm so glad that had that effect on you.
Yeah.
It's the little things. I love it when the little things really get to people.
Yeah.
And I did want it to be like, what is he even? He feels like a threat, but for him, he's also like, as a measure of also self-protection, considering where he is and some of the surroundings, and you get into that in the book when you read the book, but it's also very important for his own survival to not be seen so much as a threat, he thinks.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there's some of this he can't help because of the monster he was transformed into by Sella.
Yeah.
So he has that moment, and he's already got his physical appearance is already horrific and strange, and he's old, and he's in this bizarre lair, basically. And then you're going down and descending into it. And I want you to feel, I'm so glad that had that effect on you. Because I want you to feel like, what is he up to? What is he still going to do? Can we actually trust him? Is he maybe a double agent, for lack of a better term?
And you even say that Sarita looks at Myra and I forget who the other gentleman was to see what were they on guard? What are they doing? I was like, what are they doing? Is everything cool?
Yeah. I want there to be, this constant sense of a little bit of menace, even in a situation like that, where it's like, I'm going to see this person. They're supposed to be the person that kind of reveals a lot more of what actually is happening here and unveils certain elements of the mystery, but can we even trust them?
Mm-hmm. And
he's at a stage of where he's at in his existence. He barely feels like he can trust himself, and he still has these moments. It's again, as we've discussed, he's vampiric, and yet he's also fasting, for lack of a better term. And that was based on, again, some of the vampire research I did, where sometimes you see things that it's the absence of something. And one of the things I noticed is in the myriad ways to kill a vampire, which goes beyond the stake through the heart, all these other things. There's beheadings and burnings and taking the heart out and you got to burn it and bury them upside down or at a crossroads. There's so much crazy stuff.
Yeah.
And one of the things I noticed is not there, though, is starvation. A vampire, I didn't see anything about it starving a vampire out. A vampire can't starve to death.
Okay.
And so I was like, what would that even be like then? What if you decided...
But they can still feel starvation, right?
Yes, they have the hunger.
Yeah.
So they're feeling, but you can't
not feel starvation. That's kind of a dumb thing to say. Feel hunger.
I know. You're feeling starvation. It's a more powerful sense. It's beyond just ordinary hunger. And so I was like, what if you felt starvation basically forever? And then what if that kind of became like Zen and transcendent? So that's kind of how he achieves his sage-like status, is basically he's gotten to a point where it's like, I've mostly quelled my hunger. But there's still, he also takes, like you said, physical measures to make sure, to the best of my ability, even if I have weak moments, hopefully I won't succumb to that. It's almost like he's a eunuch, basically, where it's like, to make sure, I believe in my own self-determination and my own willpower. But just to be sure, I'll take this.
I'm going to disarm myself.
Yes. I'm going to take this relatively extreme measure. For him, it's almost the equivalent of self-castration, basically. And then at the same time, it's like, lean forward, snake-like, these things. He's getting up on the table, and it's like still a little disturbing. And it's because he's got this basically impotent desire that he hoping to never act on, but there's still a little bit of it there.
Yeah.
And this is like fresh meat, basically, I'm
Mhm.
being introduced to. And as we, get into other elements of the story too, you realize why it would be even probably more satisfying for him if he were to succumb to it and kill Sarita of all people,
Mhm.
why that would be even more probably satisfying for him than anybody else.
Yeah. Well, I won't go any further for fear of ruining the ending, but it was a great book. And as always, listeners at home, buy it, read it, and review it. September 24th?
September 24th.
September 24th. Well, will you be going, or maybe you're on one now, will you be going on a book tour for Devils Kill Devils?
Yes. Mid-August, I'll be at an event in not Grand Rapids, Michigan, Grand Haven, Michigan, which is near-ish Grand Rapids. And that'll be kind of the initial event, but it kicks off more so in earnest starting in September. I'll be doing a couple of other little convention appearances between that, but closer to the book's release, I'll be basically coast to coast. I start on the East Coast and then I end up in Washington, where I've never been to Washington before. So I'm in Seattle, so I'm looking forward to that.
Okay.
So yeah, I'll be doing a tour, and I'll release that on my Instagram and my website, letting people know where the dates are going to be for this.
Right. Well, since last we spoke, a technological juggernaut was dropped on the world in the form of AI. Has AI affected your writing positively or negatively? And if so, how?
I've got to admit, it hasn't really entered my atmosphere that much. Apparently, the Spite House was on a list of books, a huge list of books that were being used to mine data or mine information on how to write.
So your book was part of the data sets for like writing a story that has the elements that your book had. It would kind of cull from that.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah.
And I found out about that, and I just kind of shrugged. I'm somewhat ignorant, obviously, with these things. I'm not Mr. Technological expert here.
Yeah.
But I've talked to some people who are actual computer scientists and stuff, and I have a lot of different thoughts on this, because I've also noticed that there's a lot of, for lack of a better term, basically fake AI. And AI as a concept, even as it is right now, is presented as quote unquote AI. Everybody I've talked to that actually is in the know is like, it's language learning models, but that's not as catchy. Yeah. But it's not close to what artificial intelligence would actually be.
Yeah, what everybody thinks of as AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is artificial intelligence that has the ability to innovate.
Yes.
Which is the scary stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And if we ever got to that stage, then I feel like it would maybe impact some things. I've read some stuff that's just out of curiosity, that's more AI generated. I've got to say, I feel like
you don't have anything to worry about.
we as writers are pretty safe. And it reminded me of, because I do think it's one of those things that it's not going to go away, but I think it's going to level off potentially. Who knows? Again, I'm not a prognosticator or expert, but it did remind me a little bit of like when Siri first came out, and everybody I knew that had an iPhone was like so enamored with it. Oh man, it could tell you a joke.
Mm-hmm.
You can ask it anything. If you talk to it, yada, yada. And I'd be around people. Hey, Siri, tell me this. Hey, Siri, tell me that. And then when all the Alexa comes out and all the other equivalents, and then, there's just anecdotally, but I feel like we all kind of got over that to a certain degree. Like it's still there and we use it on occasion.
Yeah. But
it didn't become this like overwhelming thing. And there was an article I remember where somebody from Microsoft around that time predicted, he thought, oh, like keyboards are going to go extinct pretty soon because we're just going to be able to talk to our computers, and then we're going to develop something that allows us to kind of do touchscreen stuff. And so we're not going to need a keyboard. We're going to just be talking to computers and doing touchscreen. And we're all these years later now. I mean, Siri, that first came out, I want to say it was like 2012 when it really kind of blew up. And now we're 12 years later. We're not even anywhere near the extinction of the keyboard because A, there's a lot of practical use for it still. And also B, I know I personally, like, I'm an Android user. I'm a Neanderthal, but we have, Google, you can talk to the Google version of Siri, and I'm routinely annoyed when I have to do the voice command thing because it'll still do something really stupid.
Yeah.
And we're not really in a place with that. And I feel like that's similar to what I've seen with the AI writing, where it's like people became initially enamored with it because it was like, man, can you believe it? It can even do this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to me because as like a kind of a stunt, there was something that was like kind of the equivalent of, and it wasn't, I don't know. I think it's kind of similar in a similar range, but there was a book that came out called This Thing Between Us. And it was kind of one of those response prompts, like a little bit of a chat GPT, like, and this was before all the AI kind of controversy really exploded as much as it did. But they just used it for promoting the book. And you go in and you would talk to, because the book is about an AI house. And so the idea is like the AI goes haywire. And so as a
I'm afraid I can't do that.
Exactly. It's like you're talking to Hal, and then you say certain things, and eventually it's supposed to deteriorate, and it's still giving you responses that are like supposed to be like, oh, this is interesting, but at the same time, like it's it's pre-programmed to go in a certain direction. And obviously, ChatGPT can expand on that a little bit more, but that was already present. And so I feel like the opportunities for something like that, for like promotional purposes and doing so, because we've had all these AI stories for a while now, and you can continue to do stuff like that. So I do feel like I never want to just be entirely dismissive of the tool in terms of there are certain uses that I think it will be acceptable for. Things like I can just go out here and steal entire other works and use that. That's obviously not acceptable, but also at the same time, what you're basically saying is I want to get the worst version of this, a considerably worse version with less personality. That's not going to know, it's not going to do some of the things that like we talked about here. And I feel like it's, again, just a way less interesting version of that. I'm sure for some people that would be acceptable, but like, even if the AI could literally have written what I wrote, Devils Kill Devils, which I don't think it could have.
No.
But then it couldn't do this interview. It couldn't do this show. It wouldn't be able to tell you like, oh man, and it wouldn't be excited. It has no excitement. It has no intelligence. It has no emotion. So it wouldn't be able to like, man, like, great question. This is where I've like really started feeling this. And then I changed my mind. And it's not going to say like, well, my original ending was going to be this. And then I changed. It has no journey. Like there's no process. And without an actual journey or process to actually get there, it's going to make something far blander. And I guess the last stupid thing I'll add to it is that I'm a little bit of a wrestling fan, even though I don't really watch anymore. But for whatever reason, I'm like, I haven't watched an actual show in like God knows how long. But I still keep up with like the news of it. And I go to like wrestling forums and like, oh, I wonder what's happening. And is anything interesting going on with these? It's basically just storytelling and characters. And when ChatGPT was first kind of launching and people were like, oh my gosh, I want to do this, I was on one of the forums and they were like, oh my God, I plugged in like this wrestler's name and asked ChatGPT to write me a promo. I can't believe how good this promo is, and for people who don't know, wrestling promos, basically anytime you've ever seen a clip of like a wrestler gets on the mic and talks trash, if you've ever seen The Rock do that or whatever, that's
see.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And it was like every single one of them was like a boilerplate promo and then just trade out a catchphrase here or there. And people were like on this site, these wrestling fans were like going nuts, like, oh man, I tried it out with Ric Flair. I did one with The Rock. I can't believe how accurate it is. I was like, guys, this is not actually accurate. This is bad. This is bad writing. This is bad writing by wrestling promo standards. And there are some wrestling promos that I would encourage people to look up, like the famous Dusty Rhodes Hard Times promo, for instance, of like, this is actually really compelling character work. And you could like maybe get something out of this. It's interesting. But so we're still not talking about like necessarily peak literature here. This should be pretty easy to actually replicate if the machine is at a certain level of quote unquote intelligence. And instead it was just basically regurgitating the same thing, but it's smart enough to trade a few names here. It can go through archives and say, oh, this person likes to use this one catchphrase. Let me insert it here, even if it doesn't really fully make sense in the sentence, but it's the thing that they would say. So I've got to fit it in here somewhere to make it look like I know what I'm talking about. And I was reading that, and that was like one of the first times I was like, I think we're going to be fine. Because this thing can't even replicate a wrestling promo.
Well,
Exactly.
I think when it comes to art and anything creative, I think the thing it's got working against him, or him, it, the thing it's got working against it is actually what I guess is technically a disadvantage for us is the fact that humans are damaged.
Yes.
We have
Yeah.
issues.
Yeah.
That's why we write such compelling stuff. We have biases and hang-ups and neurosis, like a machine does not. They're pretty efficient. Zeros and ones,
Yep.
zeros and ones. So yeah, I know I sound like a broken record to anybody that regularly listens to the podcast, but I always reference the writer's strike, that one famous sign that they photographed somebody. It said, AI did not have a bad childhood or something like that. It's like, yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah. I mean, even the AI art, debates, I've seen so much AI artwork and I'm like, this looks lifeless to me.
Yeah.
There's no angle to it. And to contrast that, like there was a YouTuber I followed who pointed it out in a short, but he was talking about there's a famous painting of God sending plagues to Egypt. And there's just so much contrast. And like you said, all the biases and all the literal perspective that a human is going to give to it of I have an ambition and this is what I want to do. And so like you have light and dark contrast and symmetry in the painting, and it's trying to tell you several different things at once. And then there was an AI version of it that is like sort of accurate if you're okay with not a great image, but it's got figures, destruction, Egyptian artifacts. You can see things. But you can clearly also see that there's no like actual perspective for anything here. It's not trying to say anything. It's just like literally, if you try to like give me just an accurate depiction of this, you can't really do something accurate with something that is built on this religious occurrence that is beyond the scope of anybody to even properly process visually. But even then, even if you consider it kind of like, well, strictly speaking, this is exactly what I asked it for, and that's what it gave it to me. It's like, yeah, but there's no, again, like the bad childhood element, there's no part of itself it can really give because it has no self. So there's no part of itself it can give, much less multiple perspectives and ambition. All of that stuff, like what you mentioned, the bad childhood, that develops ambitions and perspectives. That develops, I had this bad childhood, so now I aspire to do X, Y, or Z. It has no self, so it can't create truly. It can't, because it has no aspiration. So with all that said, I guess I just felt really non-threatened by it. And I remember talking to a guy when it was first again blowing up, and I was at the Tucson Book Festival. And God bless this guy, because I didn't pick up his name. We had a brief conversation. And I hope he's out there writing well. But he was talking about, well, the good thing about ChatGPT is that, it can plug in stuff where I wouldn't have the ability to do this accurately myself. So, and he gave an example of he wanted to write a character who was a basketball player. And he's like, but I'm going to have them talk about certain things related to this in my story, but I don't know that much about basketball. And it's a small character. I don't know anybody where to start with doing like research, like who to interview. But ChatGPT can give me like lines of dialogue if I just tell it, hey, pretend you're a basketball player, yada, yada. I didn't say it to him because I was like kind of just trying to exit the conversation. My first thought was like, research like that has never been easier. Just go on YouTube. Literally everybody is talking about everything about themselves.
Yeah.
Basketball players right now, professional, amateur, otherwise, every one of them has a podcast, it feels like. Go listen to 20 minutes of the podcast. I promise you'll pick up more authentic dialogue than ChatGPT is going to give you. You can make it more naturalistic sounding. You're going to be able to give it like the little things that it's not even going to realize. You're going to be able to pick up on something small and think, man, what if I add that? What if I do this with it? What if, this is this person's perspective. They're going to talk about their own childhood ambitions and, the time they practiced against their dad and he did X, Y, or Z. And you're going to be able to pick up on this story or that and combine it. And you get to make the choices. And it's very weird to me, who part of the reason why I love doing this is I get to make the choices. But, I know not everybody's that nerdy, but I'm the dude who will like, again, playing video games. I'll spend like an inordinate amount of time. If it's like a create a character mode, Like, I'll barely get started with it. Like, I'm almost disappointed when I have to start the game. I wouldn't want this thing to be like, here, I did this for you. Go ahead now. I'm like, that just seems like joyless. And I feel like that's going to translate to the work itself. People are going to realize this person didn't even really want to do this. Like, why would I want art, literature, what have you, from somebody who it feels like didn't even really want to do it? Like, you and the machine doesn't want to do it. It has no capacity for want.
Uh-huh.
This just feels bland, and I think it's gonna be kind of stuck in that mode. So, like I said, I feel like for certain promotional purposes, there might be something fun and interesting you can do with like kind of AI gamesmanship and stuff that I feel like has existed previously and is now being marketed as AI. And that's unfortunate because there is such a understandable heavy push to say we don't want AI taking people's jobs, et cetera. So then naturally the extension from that is no AI at all.
Yeah.
But, I'm not a Photoshop expert by any means, but I've dabbled in Photoshop for a long time. And things like auto-generated fill in the background has existed in Photoshop for a very long time. Now it's being marketed as AI.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, this has been here for like, I don't even know how long, but I know it's been in there about as long as I've been messing with Photoshop, which I want to say is like 2010, 2012, somewhere in that range. I'm like, so this has been around for a very long time. And now you're marketing it as something that is going to make people feel like this is an enemy of the creative process. When really this has just been a tool that's been here this whole time, but because it's a buzzword and you feel like you can attract certain people who are not paying attention, let's just call it AI. And there's so much similar, I feel like, that's out there like that. That's like, I don't know. It all feels like much ado about this thing that I feel like, again, is kind of going to go the way of Siri, where it levels off a little bit, where people are like, it's still there and it has purposes every once in a while, but we're not nearly as obsessed with it as we were when it first came out.
Yeah.
Because there are very specific limitations. We got over the whole, Siri can tell you a joke. Siri, tell me a story. Siri, read me a poem. We got over a lot of that stuff pretty fast. But I was there for it, and I promise you, you were probably there for it too. Everybody that was there for it. When it was first blowing up, and they were doing all the commercials and everything, it was like, oh, Siri can do anything. Siri, tell me a recipe. All this other stuff. Nobody, like, I don't want to say nobody. I'm sure somebody still does it. I hardly hear anybody talking to Siri, talking to Alexa about anything unless they feel like I absolutely have to. My hands are tied, literally. But if I could just like type it in myself so that way I know I get exactly what I want and the computer doesn't make the choice for me, I'd rather do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What you were talking about as far as what they're now calling AI, there's been artificial neural networks utilized since the 50s. They've just now blown up because they figured out that I think the type of server, they could run it on this particular type of server and make it more efficient because it took up so many resources and so much computing power before that they only did it in small amounts.
Yeah.
So, well, all right. Final question, sir. I imagine that throughout your writing career, you will continue to uncover things about yourself. Is there any self-discovery that you made as a result of writing this book? Anything that you can say out loud?
I mean, there are so many different things. I mean, so much of what I discover about myself is based on the writing. I realized maybe a little bit too late in life, but thankfully, at least at this point, writing is a huge part of my identity.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been wanting to create stories since I was very young. I wrote my first short stories in like 5th grade and had them in my head before I decided I was going to try to start writing them in like 3rd grade. And a lot of kids start writing stories and then it's like, well, I wrote a little cute thing for an assignment or something like that, but like it's not really like in your DNA to keep going. And for me, it was just like this never stopped. And I just didn't realize that like in continuing this, I kind of can't help myself. This is part of who I am. So I say all that because I don't reveal a whole lot about my personal life in general in interviews or online or anything. But at the same time, I kind of am, because writing is my personal life in a lot of respects, because it is entwined in me. It's storytelling. And how fired up I get talking about this. It's so funny. You were like, how much time do you have? And I was like, I'm kind of just getting worked up. Like I tried to like, I go into most interviews trying to be like, okay, be calm, be subdued. I'm watching my mic feed, my volume feed. And it's like I'm redlining, and I could see myself then on the computer or on the screen here, and I'm like, my eyes are bulging at certain points, and I was like, you're doing it again, rein it in. But it's like I love talking about this so much.
Yeah.
And so then when I discover things about myself, a lot of the time it's about the writing process. One thing I will say I discovered about myself, well, I've always known, but it really became evident with me in writing this, is how much internal anger I'm always kind of nursing.
Really?
To a certain degree. Yeah, I try to be a happy person. I try to be I don't want to say optimistic because I feel like that sounds a little bit naive, but I believe in fighting, if nothing else. It's, the Morgan Freeman at the end of Seven, the world is a good place and worth fighting for. I believe in the second part.
Mm.
It's worth fighting for. And I'm always like in that mode, kind of. And I'm always in the mode of like, let's talk about something interesting and exciting. And that's why I like doing this. I don't skew negative on a lot of stuff just because I feel like it's not as interesting. I have a lot more fun talking about, let's have fun. let's talk about good stories. Let's sit around and talk about what's your favorite thing you read and why you loved it. And if it did have flaws, let's talk about that too. Like it doesn't have to be all sunshine and roses, but at the same time, like I say, the anger that's in there, I'm always kind of subduing that to a certain degree. And I know it's always present. And I feel like I realized that when I wrote the scene, like I said, when Sarita and Everett kind of reach a certain understanding of, we might be kind of kindreds, this odd couple potentially here of Sarita with Tori and David and anybody else that could potentially help her. Nobody's really presented her with like, I'll help you get revenge. I'll help you go on a killing spree if that's what it takes. And Everett's got that anger in him, and Sarita's got that, and they match up. And that like was one of my favorite moments to come to. And then when I wrote it, it was like, I connected with these characters, and I was like, oh God, like this is, I think, a thing in me always as well, where it's like, if somebody's there to match a certain, like, hey, I've got this buried anger in me too about certain things in the world and injustices and what have you. And it's like, do you want to connect on that level a little bit? And it's like, damn, like I've known that's there, but it was like the way I connected with these characters in that moment and really found out this is one of my favorite scenes, and kind of cut it short a little bit deliberately because I didn't want to overindulge in that moment. That was something, I guess, relatively personal about myself that I kind of discovered through the book. And then just side that I was alluding to previously about the writing identity. The thing I discovered really is that as much as I love the Spite House and it's my first child in the world and it changed my life literally, and I love that book to pieces, I'd get a bigger kick out of writing some carnage. There was
nothing wrong with guilty pleasures.
I mean, it was just because I was just really like, oh my God, I think I'm pretty good at this part. And I'm not one to plug myself through like, I got a review here or what have you. It's, reviews are not for writers, as Gabino Iglesias says. Mm-hmm. But, you have to promote to a certain degree. But I will admit, like, recently I got a review, I think it was in Library Journal, a very favorable review. And they described the book as gorgeously gory.
Yeah.
And I was like, that might be the best compliment I've ever received.
You need to tell that person to blurb the book.
Seriously, I was like, I want to put that on, if this was like movie posters I could plaster downtown, that would be my thing. Because it's strange because I grew up and I still feel like I'm a little bit of a squeamish person, oddly enough. I'm always like, oh God, I heard this is like a really gory movie. I heard this has a really crazy kill. But then I see it and I'm like, a lot of it just boils down to, was this executed well? If it's just gory for its own sake, then I'm kind of underwhelmed a lot of the time. But it's like, if it's like Hellraiser, and I'd like immediately think, like, gorgeously gory made me think of the movie Hellraiser and like the scene where he's reconstituting himself from like being like sludge, basically, and the blood, he's finally coming back together. And I'm like, it's grotesque, but it's also really beautiful and majestic. And even the music in that scene is kind of like presented as this glorious moment, and it's really horrific and disgusting. But I'm like, it's gorgeously gory.
Hell yeah.
Like it. And I feel like I have a couple of, and like some of my favorite moments writing this were like, oh God, that's pretty brutal, but I don't feel like it's gratuitous. I went into writing thinking I want to kind of do violence like Martin Scorsese does it in movies, where it's like, you saw this, but it was in your mind maybe even worse than what it really was. Like the scene in Casino, it's got that guy's head in a vice.
Yeah.
It's brutal.
Yeah.
And I remember hearing about it before I ever watched it. And they were like, oh, his eye pops out. And I'm expecting like, and then like you actually see it and it's like a slight bulge.
Yeah.
And it cuts away immediately. And it's worse in your head, but it's also still there.
But you see the guys like, oh, like even the guys that are doing it even grosses them out. So it makes you feel even worse. Yeah.
100%. It's still visceral. And it's like, so I was like, I want to write stuff kind of in that way. I try not to feel like I'm lingering on it. Look at how gory it can get necessarily. But I do feel like hopefully I'm writing stuff that has that impact where you're visceral and you're feeling like, oh, like I can sense how disgusted other characters would be at this and how freaked out and horrified. And so there's some juicy bits here.
Mm-hmm.
And again, a lot of it's also taken from old lore, but if it's like, oh, I get to do this because this is what's in there. I remember just describing how I've read it, and I didn't have this in here, but I kind of wanted to. Reading in one of the older lore pieces about a vampire's coffin actually being filled with blood.
Mm.
When they had a suspected vampire, they dug him up, they open it, and his coffin is filled with blood. And he's kind of also seen as like bloated and purplish because of how much blood he's been drinking. Basically, he's like burst at the seams. He's overfeeding when he's out here, and he's like bursting at the seams almost. And so I have a little bit of an allusion to that in the book, but I didn't quite indulge in that. But I remember describing that to somebody, and they were like, "Oh God, that's so gross." And I was like, "It's actually one of the coolest things I've ever read." And I was like, "I can't wait to use it." But and this is another horror writer, and they was like, "That's pretty fucking gross." Like, I didn't like. She was like, "This, it's like there are ticks overfeeding," and I was like, "Yeah. It's pretty great, right?" And they were like, "That's pretty fucking gross." But I realized that about myself a little bit, that like I really do love writing ghost stories, and I have a fondness for ghost stories. The Fog is one of my favorite movies of all time, and it's virtually bloodless. It's the most ridiculous R rating in maybe movie history. It should not be an R-rated movie at all. There's no sex. I mean, there's no nudity. It's bloodless, and even the swearing is like less than I've seen in PG-13 movies. It's absurd. And it's one of my favorite horror movies, and it's my favorite John Carpenter film, even though it's not his best film, because I love ghost stories that much. So I do have an extreme fondness for ghost stories and like that method of horror where it's like it doesn't have to be carnage on the screen. That said, I do feel like I have a talent for it, maybe. And I've never written anything extreme horror wise, and I don't know if I'd ever want to, even though I have a lot of respect for that subgenre.
Do it.
It's just
what was that?
You were capturing the spirit from that's trying to tell me, do it, try it. I mean, it definitely awakened in me the possibility that like I might try that one of these days, because I have a lot of ideas that I've like freaked myself out with, where I'm like, I don't know if I should ever try to write this, just in terms of how gory and ridiculous it would be. But getting to indulge a little bit in it and kind of enjoying some of the massacre scenes more than I expected to. I was like, this is maybe saying something about myself as a writer, which is saying something about me as a person a little bit. Yes. Oh man.
Well, Johnny, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Oh, likewise. Anytime you want me on, if you want to come on my podcast, anything of the sort, man. Oh. I love talking to you, man. This is a blast.
Hell yeah. Feeling is mutual. Well, as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug or let your readers know about? Some things you maybe want to reiterate?
September 24th, the book is coming out. Just get out there. Hopefully, I'll be posting my tour schedule. So if I'm in your neck of the woods, feel free to come through, and we can chat about horror. We can chat about any other thing that you want to talk about here. And I guess, to stay in a bit of a safe zone to a certain extent, but the world is not lost. Keep fighting. Show up and win has been my mantra lately. So keep showing up, show up to events, show up and do stuff. There's a lot of sometimes negativity in the world today, and I completely understand, but you show up, it's important to show up and win. That's the important thing. You'll win at life, and we can still fight for this better world. It's worth fighting for.
Well said. All right. Well, listeners at home, all links are in the description. And Johnny, thank you again for joining me.
Thanks. Have a great one.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, and follow my YouTube channel so that you can watch the episodes live. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.